Hey, welcome back to the Cheap Air Gunner channel. It's Cherokee Steve. There have been some developments on my conversion from CO2 to HPA. Still waiting to pick up the gun itself, the 2400 KT from the Crossman Custom Shop, along with the plans I had to basically be able to remove the grip frame and switch it back and forth from the stock CO2 version to an HPA setup. I went ahead and ordered a second 18-inch Crossman barrel and a probe, bolt probe. Those two things came in. I have the assembled version here. I've got lots of pictures and I'm going to go over what I did. Didn't make video of the things, but the pictures pretty well explain it. The first step I did, wanting to convert this bolt into an extended probe bolt. So let me show a picture of that. Now this was done on a lathe, and I still didn't get it. As you can see from the picture, it's not perfectly straight. Going facing off, there's a slight radius on the end of the bolt, the stock bolt probe. I faced that off flat, went in with a center drill for my drill to follow. And regardless, the drill still walked somewhat as I went in, not too far, did not want to go past the flared out portion just in front of the O-ring. So it really wasn't too deep, but even in that little area of travel, the drill still walked a little bit. But it should hopefully suffice for being able to push and load pellets without any problem. Really, the hardest part of that process was making the little extended tip, very small piece of metal rod, rounded off the end, that would be the end pushing the pellet so as not to damage anything to the skirt or inside of the skirt. Didn't want any sharp edges. But it's so small that it really was hard to work with at the point that it was cut to the length I wanted. After having the probe itself drilled out and the tip made, it was just a process of epoxying it into position. Second thing I did was test fit the barrel to the breech. Now, it was an extremely tight fit, to the point where I didn't have it fully seated where it should be, the barrel inside of the breech. But I was afraid that if I forced it in, I wasn't going to be able to get them back apart. So at the point that it really started to bind up, I went ahead and pulled them apart, marked the area on the barrel that would be fully seated into the breech if it were in the breech, and started polishing it by hand with Scotch-Brite pad. Smeared a little bit of silicone grease, and then it started to go in. It's still extremely tight, but to the point where I knew if I got it fully seated, I would still be able to twist the breech and the barrel in opposite directions and get them separated, since there were some modifications I wanted to do to the barrel port. Let me show a picture of the barrel in its stock form, other than the fact that it's been hand polished. Now, getting back to that stock barrel port, that measured with my calipers 135 in diameter. That was just way too small. It's something I have done with my 2289 and its modification and getting the airflow to be much better, I already explained when I went over the kit. I did the video on the kit itself, the CO2 to HPA conversion kit that I ordered off eBay. I explained how I was not going to use the transfer port that came with it because it was just so restrictive. The idea of that, I can't remember the exact size. I want to say it was even smaller than what a stock Crossman breech would be. One of the modifications I've done to all of my air guns that I modified is to open up the diameter of any transfer port that is related to the gun itself. The first step in modifying the barrel port was putting a nice large chamfer on the outside of the port. The reason for that was I need a nice surface for, this is just an example of what I used for the transfer port. This plastic tube that is sold for a water line to a refrigerator. It's 250 in outer diameter. So what I wanted that chamfer to be, although there is a stock chamfer there, it's not large enough for a 250 diameter to fit snugly into. So, using my cheap Harbor Freight drill press that I keep out in my garage, and a chamfer tool, resting the barrel in the slot of my 4-inch vise with a rag underneath it, I was able to open up the stock chamfer to a larger chamfer that did measure just slightly over 250 in diameter across. This material is somewhat flexible and compressible, so getting it cut with a nice straight edge to the proper length is important to get it to sit inside and on that chamfer for a nice sealing surface when everything is put together. After using the chamfer tool with the drill press to open up that stock chamfer to the size that I wanted, it was a matter now of opening up the barrel port itself. Again, using the drill press in a series of 3 drills. Inside the barrel goes a wooden dowel to keep the drill from going too far and damaging the opposite side of the barrel ID. So while all this is done, keep this inside the barrel. The series of drills I used were the stock, first of all, the stock barrel port is 135 in diameter. The first drill I used was 141 in diameter, so it really isn't removing too much material. The next step up from the 141 drill is a 147 drill. Go back in after changing out the drill press with that drill. Final drill that I use is 155 in diameter. Switch out that drill in the drill press and final size the barrel port with the 155 drill. Here's a look at the finished barrel port with the polished barrel end, the larger chamfer, and the opened up diameter on the barrel port. The next step is to deburr the inside of the port. Obviously, you don't want any burrs sticking up that the pellet is going to get loaded and scraped against and damaged. I use a hook scraper and a jeweler's file. I go in with the hook scraper first. It's a really good tool for breaking the inside edge of any hole. Then I go in with the jeweler's file through the loading port end of the barrel, very lightly, working the file back and forth across the edges of that hole. Here's a picture of the tools that I use, hook scraper and jeweler's file. The jeweler's file has been modified. I've shortened it down from its overall length in both the edge of the cut end of it. I also shortened the handle. Now, to confirm that I've done a decent job deburring the inside of that barrel port, I take a 22 caliber pellet, push it in through the loading port end of the barrel, and with the wooden dowel, push the pellet in across the port. Just far enough to get the pellet across. Make sure that it isn't hanging up, there isn't any noticeable drag to the pellet. The only thing that should be noticeable on the pellet is the rifling marks from the rifle itself. There shouldn't be any deep nicks. There shouldn't be any burrs sticking out from any edges of the pellet. But here's a look at the pellet that I had used after it got pushed back out of the barrel after being slid across the barrel port. Here's a look at the opened up bore and the barrel and the breech assembled together and lined up properly. Now at this point, with the barrel inserted into the breech, seated as deep as it'll go, and confirming that the holes have lined up, the port in the breech with the port in the barrel, which they did very nicely. Give credit to the breech manufacturer, who is the same seller of the conversion kit. One thing I do like about this particular breech, it does have two clamping screws on top. Not just a single one, but two. Here and here. So with the barrel inserted, I gently tighten those down. It's a great extra precaution, necessary precaution, especially with the high pressure of air that's going to be forced through there. It is an extremely tight fit still between the barrel and the breech itself, but having those two clamping screws really makes for a very solid setup. Obviously, with an 18-inch barrel, you want everything to be straight, nothing cocked, and this particular breech really allowed for that. Then it was just a matter of, before putting everything together, inserting the bolt with the extended probe far enough in with the hole in the bolt lined up with the slot in the breech to install the handle. Bolt probe assembly. Then came the most time-consuming portion of the assembly, and that is test fitting the breech with the transfer port. The transfer port is an extremely tight fit inside of the valve tube of the conversion kit. So I had that seated as far as it would go up against the valve, which is inside the tube. Once it was pressed into place, it was not going anywhere. I made sure that I left a pretty decent length of tubing, knowing I would have to trim it down. Can always take material off. You can't put material back on for the most part. Test fitting the breech on top of the tube with the transfer port lined up with the breech port and the barrel port. It's constant sitting the breech on here by hand I also used a quick clamp, but making sure that it's not tilted or rocking back and forth as it sits on there, which it was, with the transfer port tube cut as long as I had left it. I trimmed it off little bit by little bit by little bit, test fitting the breech onto the tube after each cut. I used an X-Acto knife to make the cuts to the tube itself. It's really, really difficult to get a straight cut with the X-Acto knife. So once I knew I was close to the size I wanted, it wasn't just a matter of cutting with the X-Acto knife, but following that up with filing it nice and straight and flat. Then retest fitting the breech onto the tube. Once I got to the point where it was short enough where the breech would sit on there, but there was just a crack of light as I would hold the assembly up. Not screwed down at all, just with the quick clamp, holding it in place, holding it up to a nice bright light. There was just a smidgen of light coming through. Now, knowing that the tubing itself is compressible, I stopped at that point. Then I started to use the breech screws, the one in the back, the larger one, longer one, I should say, and larger one, and the one that goes underneath. At this particular point, I stopped cutting with the X-Acto knife. Any adjustments I needed to make to the length of the tube were strictly with the file. Once I got down to an extremely small but noticeable crack of light, I stopped and firmly clamped this down with the quick clamp. Installed the back screw and the small screw that goes underneath the bolt in the bottom of the breech. Tightened that down very firmly, while relatively firm but not too firm on the back one. Everything seemed to sit nice and flat. The other thing is there's no binding of the bolt as it gets pressed back. I also want to point that out about the breech. It's a nice fit between the bolt and the bolt hole that's machined into the breech itself. Overall, as I mentioned in a previous video, getting all of this to sit the way that it should, and the work I had to do to the bottom of the breech, that should not have to be done. With that said, with it being done and having it cleared out to the point where it fit properly, all the other aspects of the breech are really good. Really give it a thumbs up. As far as the stiffness of it, as far as the fit between the barrel and the breech, as far as the clamping that's included with the breech for the barrel, as far as the machined hole for the bolt and the actuation between the bolt and the pin that sticks up from the hammer, everything seems to fit and work very nicely. So I do want to call that out on the manufacture of the breech itself. Here's a picture basically of this, the final assembly. The only difference is I have the forearm. It's very short. Basically, it's a finger or two finger rest removed currently. but it was installed. I'm making a couple of changes to it, but here's a look at that final assembly. And that's where I'm at. As soon as I can pick up the gun itself, I will do a full test on it completely in its stock version. I do want the option of being able to use the gun in its complete stock version before moving on to trying it out with this assembly. I also wanted the ability to go back and forth if I want to use it in its stock form as a CO2 gun. I can do that. Remove the grip frame, install it on here, and I can use it as basically as a PCP 22 caliber gun. One of the things I did notice with this length of a barrel, it doesn't take much. It does seem to be a very nice even gap between the bottle and the barrel. So I like how the barrel is sitting, but it takes very little pressure to get the barrel to move. What I may have to do, what I'm thinking about doing is to come up with some type of barrel band for this, for extra support and rigidity for the barrel. Now, it would have to be something that slips over the bottle and yet supports the barrel. And I'm not sure what the best way is to go about doing that. The most logical thing I can think of is using some type of piece of wood with two holes, one of them obviously very large, so that it could slip over the bottle and yet be teardrop shaped with a smaller hole on top to fit over the barrel and support the barrel. If there's any other ways, any other ideas that you guys may have in mind that you can clue me in on, I am all ears. I'm not really sure about what I want to do. I want it to look decent, but yet obviously be functional and support the barrel. Maybe there's an easier way, something that doesn't have to slide over the bottle that you can think of. Really would appreciate any feedback you might have on that before actually going about and start cutting and or machining something that would act as a barrel band for this assembly. That's where it's at. Anything I can get updated, I will get a video up on. Really appreciate you guys checking this out. Really happy up to this point with how everything has turned out. And really quick, I wanted to give a big thanks to all of you subscribers. I just hit 200. Really happy about that. Believe me, I'm ecstatic that the word is spreading. I'm hopefully making some good informational videos. Hopefully I'm helping you guys out there. Tune in, and I'll have some updates at some point, obviously, on this particular project. Until then, you guys stay safe and shoot safe. Take care.